I Fix Computers That No One Else Will. Written by begforanegg. I knocked on the door and waited. In any line of work that involves going to people's house, you quickly realize it takes a while for the person on the other side to stop doing whatever they're doing and come answer. I'd been told about this specific house and how no one else on the team wanted to go here and how it was one of the most dangerous by far. No specific reason given. Alright, I should probably explain myself. I work for a tech support company. Yes, an actual tech support company. And my job consists of going to people's houses, plugging what I like to call the magic stick into the broken computer, and letting it do its work. See, thing is, unlike other team members, I don't actually have any background in computer security or any sort of technological science. I actually majored in psychology. I wanted to be a therapist. That didn't turn out well. I do, however, have an infinite pool of luck, seemingly, because I managed to ace an interview for a job that pays well, I'm not qualified for, and is incredibly easy. Now here comes the downside. Due to the fact that my knowledge on how a computer works is so limited, I have to take the, how do I say this kindly? Most dangerous ones. Usually it's something like cults, cryptids, cults of cryptids, and anything in between. I am, however, paid extra for taking these jobs, and also, probably, to keep my mouth shut. Of course, I'm guessing, as it's unlikely they'd include, talk to anyone and see how many limbs you wake up with in the contract. But it was pretty heavily implied. The house was 2 stories tall and a grayish color. It stood in the middle of nowhere, pretty much, and stood out pretty strongly against the dense forestry surrounding it. The door swung open, and what looked to be a young woman, if I had to guess I'd say mid-20s, stood just past the doorframe. Immediately, she grabbed my arm and pulled me into the house and hurriedly slammed the door behind me. Great. It's one of these. Well, the job pays well enough. Immediately, I noticed the blue tattoo on the side of her neck. It seemed to be an eye, maybe? Anyway, she grabbed my arm again and led me to a room at the back of the house on the first floor, threw me in, and then slammed the door behind me. For a moment, I didn't move from next to the door and looked around, worried that there may be something else in here. But after a moment of silence, I relaxed and looked around me. There was an old-style computer in the middle of the room on a wooden desk. The room wasn't very big, but it was big enough for me to be able to walk around the desk. I inspected the wires, presumably connecting to a power source, that just ran along the desk, onto the floor, and into the ceiling. Other than that, the room was empty. One window on the wall with a lot of natural light flooding in, and white walls. Pretty average, which put me on edge. Never is it a good sign when the danger is not immediately noticeable. I sat on my knees in front of the computer and pressed the on button, seeing powering on screen, followed by the picture from a cave onto a beach. Oh, the computer ran Windows 10. For something that looked so old, it was truly a surprise. But anyway, I have a job to do, and the sooner I get out of here, the better. I searched the computer for a moment to find an available USB slot, and upon finding one, fished the magic stick out of my pocket and plugged it in. A small light lit up orange on the stick to say that it was working, and I got up, took my bag to the corner, and sat down. When you're doing this job, never, and I mean never, sit in front of the screen while it is working. Best case scenario, the light on the stick switches to green to show it's finished, and you leave. Worst case scenario, much more common, can be anything ranging from the screen exploding and spraying glass everywhere to something worse, like something trying to climb out of the computer. It is not my job to deal with anything that crawls out. That is the problem of either my company or the person who lives here. Depends on who arrives first, really. Anyway, as I'm starting to wonder about what could possibly be so bad about this house, the woman from before comes in, stands in the open doorway, staring at the computer with wide eyes. I shuffle about a bit and start bringing my bag up to my lap so that I can grab my hammer if needed, and if not, then I could also grab some lunch. The stick takes anything from an hour to a day, and so I bring along a lunch and some money in case it lasts even longer. Usually if it takes longer than 3 hours, it means it's going to go all day. Slowly, her gaze turns from the computer to me, and then back to the computer before she slams the door shut, and I listen as her footsteps disappear down the hall and double while coming back down. The door swings open again, and my hand tightens on the hammer in my bag, but loosens when I realize there's another person with her. Another young woman with the same tattoo on her neck. Awesome. It's a cult. The door shuts, and once again their footsteps go up the hallway and come down doubled. The door swings open and reveals twice the people, all young women with the same neck tattoo. This continues happening until the entirety of what I can see of the doorway seems to be filled with wide-eyed young women who seem completely bewildered by both my presence and the computers. As much as I want to ask questions, I learned pretty quickly that usually cults don't have the answers you're looking for either, and that's why I'm there. They were all wearing the same thing, what looked to be a hospital gown of sorts. Nothing too spooky really, and they all looked back and forth from me to the computer. None dared enter the room. If anything, it seemed like the one in front was actually preventing the other ones from entering. I didn't mind them all coming to watch me work and just chalked it up as some unexplainable quirk of an otherwise normal cult. Well, as normal as a group of young women in hospital gowns can be. I decided it's probably best if I left for a moment, in case anything that could kill me happened. Plus, I really needed a piss. I grabbed my bag and walked to the doorway, noticing how as far as I could see, the entire hall was filled with these women. I shuffled my way past the first few and excuse me'd my way through the last few, all of them staring at me with bewildered eyes before going back to staring towards the doorway, almost like they're lining up. Once I make it back to the front door, I open it up and immediately hear several pairs of footsteps traveling through the house towards me. Quickly, I hop out and go to shut it, but not before seeing a woman turn the corner in the house just past the doorway, baring her teeth in me and sprinting. I shut the door and hurriedly go back to my van, looking back and seeing women staring at me from the windows of the house. All the windows. Nothing really noteworthy happens in the next 20 minutes. I finally take a piss at a nearby diner and have my lunch before returning to the house, mostly just to go retrieve the stick so I can prove I actually did my job. Something my manager seems to try his hardest to prove wrong. The thing about the stick is, it seems to somehow have proof on it of every time I fix something. I don't entirely understand it, honestly, but that's to be expected. When I returned to the house, it was different. The windows were boarded up, but not with wood or anything like that. It was a pale, almost white color, and the material covered the window frame perfectly. It seemed to be on the outside of the windows too. The material seemed to have a few patches of brown on it too. I walked up to the door and knocked. The door slowly swung open. I reasoned with myself for a second before deciding to step in and make my way towards the computer room. Usually cults aren't very nice to intruders, so I grasped my hammer and held it close to my side as I slowly and quietly traversed the house. It seems insane that I'd even enter, but I'd seen worse, and also I really needed this paycheck. I also examined the walls on my way, noticing how occasionally there'd be teeth or hair coming off the wall, as if it was a part of it. Pretty typical cult behavior, honestly. Nothing too out of the cult ordinary. But as soon as I turned the corner that took me to the hall that led to the computer room, I noticed something was off. First of all, the computer room at the end was incredibly dark, as the window in there must have been boarded off too. But the same material that boarded up the windows now covered the walls and seemed to be slowly but surely continuing outwards and covering more of the wall and floor. That's when I heard the crunching sound coming from the room. It was rhythmic and sounded like someone eating chicken, bones and all. I walked down the hall and noted the material on the floor was now squishy and soft. All the more reason not to touch it and to get out of here quickly. I stopped at the doorway. The room was full of the young girls from earlier, all crammed into this dark room, and occasionally, when the rhythmic crunching sound stopped, they'd all moved a step, and it continued. This didn't really ring any alarms. A lot of cults will dance around some object of worship. What worried me was the sound and how loud it was. It was almost unbearable. I stepped in, being completely ignored by the sea of women, and made my way towards the stick. I had to wait before the sound had stopped for me to push through the last few women to the desk where there was a small clearing around the front of it. And on the screen, there was a set of normal human teeth with gums framing the sides. Great. Glad to see the stick probably was finished. Thank God. I looked down and grabbed the stick from the computer's back, but when I stood up and slowly put the stick back in my pocket, the crowd shifted once again. The nearest woman in front of the computer came forwards and reached forward with her head to the screen as if she was going to kiss it. I stopped and stared, and to my surprise, the teeth on the screen opened, and when her head reached them and should have been stopped by the layer of glass, her head continued in, and before I could fully connect the dots, the teeth came down onto her head and went completely through. Her body falling limp on the desk as half her head was consumed and the loud noise continued. To my horror, I realized what the noise was. The mouth on the screen devouring these young women. I stood frozen as I also then realized the pale material was their skin, and their teeth, and hair. And as I stood there, the woman behind the body lifted the legs up and continued to feed the body to the monitor. The crunching sound continuing, and slowly, her body disappearing into the awaiting maw. I pushed through the crowd, elbowing a couple of people on the way out, but was met with no resistance. I made it out into the hallway and ran through the house, a feeling of sickness in my stomach growing as I realized there were more teeth and more hair on the walls as I left, and when I reached the door and I grasped the door handle, I almost screamed. It squished under my grasp. It was an eyeball. I gritted my teeth and twisted it, and the door opened, pieces of skin tearing as the door frame had been covered on the outside with the stuff. I ran to my van and looked back at the house as I opened my door. One window hadn't been covered. It was an upstairs window, and in it I could vaguely make out a face on the ceiling of the room inside. No, in its ceiling. 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. The eyes suddenly looked right at me through the distant window, and a smile slowly crept onto its face before its mouth opened, and a person, probably another woman, jumped up and was caught halfway through by the mouth clamping down, her lower half falling to the floor, and blood splattering all over what I could see of the room from the bottom of the lawn. I quickly climbed into my car and left and didn't look back. Boss was not going to believe this one. When I got back to headquarters, I went up to my boss and explained the situation, what happened, and handed him the USB stick. He simply shrugged, said it was probably a trick of the light, and went to his office. I was left with no explanation for the hell on earth I'd just seen, and got ready to pack up my stuff. I got back in my van to go home, hoping that was the last I'd ever see of that building. Which made it even more of a shock when I woke up one night and looked out my window only to see the house across from mine a slightly paler shade than it was before. Well, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's episode, and please subscribe or follow for more. And if you would like, I'd really appreciate it if you would follow me on Twitter at ClancyPasta, and I will talk to you all later. Have a good night, everybody. Cheers.